Welcome back to the programme. I'm Nima Abouardi. Now, the members of OPEC influence the price of oil by controlling supply. And last week, OPEC held its first meeting since the Arab uprising began and the price of oil started to climb. But there was an unusual display of tension between members as they failed to agree on production quotas. So what's the reason for what's been described as OPEC's worst meeting ever? That's a question I put to energy economist Robin Mills.
It's really down to the fundamental divergence in the interests of the members. You have the, I guess you could call them the Gulf Four, which is really Saudi Arabia plus Kuwait, UAE and Qatar. Now they have the ability to increase production, they still have some spare capacity, versus the seven who were the holdouts at the OPEC meeting, which is really led by Iran and Venezuela, and I guess you could say Libya, although of course Libya is out of the game right now. They don't have the ability to increase production, so they didn't want OPEC to announce an increase. They were pushing for higher prices.
And what now? Well,
OPEC's credibility has taken a bit of a hit because of this meeting and the failure to reach agreement. But OPEC has been through worse crises than this in the past when its members were shooting at each other. So I think that we shouldn't ride its obituary yet. I think OPEC will plaster over the cracks at some point, but this fundamental divergence is just going to persist until there's a real change in the management of the oil sector in some of the countries which are struggling to keep their production up.
So what is the role of OPEC these days?
I think OPEC has always functioned at its best in a crisis, when its members were threatened by low prices. Right? So in, say, 98, 99, when oil was down at $10 a barrel, and then again in the middle of the financial crisis in late 2008, the members were really threatened and they were all able to hang together and reach agreement and cut production to save their economies. So in that kind of crisis, OPEC is effective and relevant. When prices go very high, on the other hand, there's much less willingness for anybody to bear a bit of pain for the greater good, when times are relatively easy. So I think that as long as prices remain comfortably high, yes, OPEC's relevance is limited.
So longer term, what do you think will happen with the price of oil?
That really depends very much on Iraq and whether Iraq can somewhat live up to its ambitious plans for expansion. Now, if Iraq really delivers on these plans, recently the oil minister was talking about scaling back the targets to, let's say, 6 or 7 million barrels a day. That would still be a huge increase in production, and that would clearly drive down prices if the Iraqis managed to get close to that. Now, at that point, or actually well before that, they would have to go back to OPEC and say, look, the time has come, we need to get back into the quota system. And they would want a quota at least on parity with Iran, which is around 3.7 million barrels a day. Probably they'd want a bigger quota. So I think that's the next big crunch point for OPEC, is when that day comes.
And that'll be the cause of much argument. So will OPEC fall apart?
Well, OPEC will continue to exist as an organisation. Will two of its members, or two or more of its members, have a big argument? I think that's very likely. If Iraq can get the security right, if Iraq can get the policies right and really increase its production, for the first time since the 70s, the Saudis would face a fellow member of OPEC of similar weight to themselves. And then the dynamics are very, very different. Now there isn't a single member who can kind of whip the others into line. That, I think, would be very interesting, change in the dynamics. Hard to say how that would play out.
Energy economist Robin Mills speaking to me earlier. Now let's see what other business stories are making headlines across the region this week.